Okay, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, good night perhaps even to everyone, and welcome to this session of the Open Publishing Fest, the panel discussion on open infrastructure principles for third-party involvement. This session was sparked by the publication of the draft Guiding Principles on Management of Research Information and Data in the Netherlands by the Dutch research institutions. And a precursor of that was also used in the Dutch negotiations with Elsevier, which led to an agreement last week. So it's really actual recent developments. And in this session, we aim to discuss the role of such principles in collaboration on open science services more in general. And in this sense, it's also closely connected to the earlier sessions in the Open Publishing Fest, the fireside chats that Cameron Nayland had with Amy Brand and Claudio Aspesi yesterday, and also with Caitlin Tenay of Invest in Open Infrastructures earlier in the Fest. We are Bianca Kramer and Jeroen Bosman of Utrecht University. We are moderating this session in the 2020 Open Publishing Fest. And our colleague Jeroen Zondervan is also keeping an eye on Twitter discussion and also moderating, like muting people and keeping an eye on that side of things. So thank you, Jeroen, for taking care of that. Some housekeeping things. I think you're all familiar with the normal housekeeping things for these kind of meetings by now. But please all mute yourself and put your questions or comments. Please put them in the chat, because we will try to incorporate them in the discussion. But please keep your microphone muted. Let's see, and also keep your video off, except for the panelists. This session is being recorded, and it will also be posted on YouTube after the fact. But it will not include the chat. So whatever you put in the chat, that will not be shared on YouTube afterwards. We're running this on the platform Big Blue Button, which is an open source platform which is hosted for the Open Publishing Fest by Cloud68. I'm really happy to be able to use that. And I think that's all for logistics. So I'd like to give the word to Jeroen to start the session proper. Jeroen, you are still muted.
Thank you. We will start with giving the floor to our 5 great panelists. They will introduce themselves just very briefly. And they will also share their first thoughts on one or perhaps a little bit more of the principles that were part of the guiding principles that were drafted by the VSNU in the Netherlands. But of course, they are free to pick any of these and reflect on those. So I would like to give the floor first to Kristen. Kristen, could you please unmute and introduce yourself and give some reflection on these principles?
Yes, thanks. Thanks very much for setting this up. It's going to be a really interesting discussion. My name is Kristen Ratan. I'm the founder of Stratos, which is Strategies for Open Science, which is an organization promoting and advocating open science, as well as helping open science projects succeed. Prior to that, I was a co-founder of the Collaborative Knowledge Foundation and the publisher at PLOS, among other publishing infrastructure roles with Highwire Press and Adapon. So I have a long history in the scholarly communication world, with about the last 15 years of it very focused on open access, open publishing, open science. I find this a fascinating conversation because I think if we look to what's happening in the world at large, we can see how many missteps there have been because of disconnects between the values of the community or the public or even governments and the practices, the goals and targets of many of the providers we work with. And we're seeing these disconnects regularly happening, and there are some root causes here that I feel the guiding principles really try to address. So, for example, there are algorithms that have encoded bias. We're seeing this with Facebook. You know, Amazon in the US, Amazon had an algorithm that was supposed to define where they were going to roll out same-day deliveries, and it turned out to be extremely biased towards wealthy neighborhoods. And that was not presumably the intention. And when the same-day deliveries began, various cities around the US started to, stand up and say, wait, we're not getting any service here, and this is unfair. There are data ownership issues I think we're very keenly aware of. Who owns your data when you're interacting with any provider? And this is true if you read Google's terms of service. They own pretty much everything you put on a Google Doc or in a Google sheet or in the slides, unless you have paid for some sort of private enterprise version. And I think while people are sort of loosely aware of that, many of us use those services and just assume, well, it'll all be okay in the end, but we're really not sure. And again, circling back to Facebook, how your data is being used and how it may be manipulated or mined or shared or monetized can be extremely concerning. So if you then apply this to scholarship, what you're looking at is the ability for third parties, maybe even not identified third parties, to mine the research that people are doing, who they're doing it with, what potential outcomes those might be, whether there are weapons or drugs that could be derived from this research, being able to access that information much further in the pipeline than the rest of us, than the public might be able to. I think it's extremely alarming. And so I think we have to take a very values-driven approach. We have to have those values well understood first. And then there are ways, and people are evolving new ones all the time, to ensure that those values are actually in the algorithms and testing algorithms for bias of various kinds, ensuring that those values are expressed in who is building the software and how those services are being created around software. All of this is entirely possible if we invest in a values-driven approach. So again, I think that the guiding principles here are an excellent first step, and I hope that they can lead to pervasive action.
Thank you very much, Kristen. That's a very clear first statement. Thank you very much for that. I would now like to give the floor to Egon Willighagen. Please, could you unmute yourself and introduce yourself and give some first statements on guidelines?
Hi, yeah, I'm Egon Willighagen. I'm a researcher at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. By origin, I'm a chemist, now in the field of biology. I've been using open science for quite a long time because my field of research is more in the area of data analysis. I need access to data. And yeah, this basically is a problem. And we will see that in the panel discussion, I think very clearly. There was one thing that Kristen just mentioned about us giving away data and knowledge to others. This is something that is very familiar, unfortunately. This is something that we have been doing as scientists for a very long time. We've been giving away our knowledge to other people, hoping for the best. This is what publishing was evolving around. But some 20 years ago, something interesting happened. Open science started. And I was running into the closed science aspect of, well, science in general at the time, because I could not access the information that I was interested in. I was limited to just what was handed to me. So for me as a researcher, I got involved in open science very early on. So more than 20 years ago already, which makes the whole field and the extremely slow progress quite frustrating. In the past 20 years, I've been very much involved in making knowledge as open, as freely as possible, enabling other people to do things with this in a liberal way, giving people rights rather than restricting rights. Even commercial reuse of information is something that I can live with. If we talk about open collaboration with commercial partners, that should be possible. We have in the Netherlands a very strong knowledge economy, maybe not as strong as we always like to be, but a lot of interest there, a lot of small companies that try to work with the research being done. So this is something that I will touch upon in these guidelines, because the way they're phrased with the universities as a provider of some data slash metadata, but not really defining what it is, not really defining what they want to achieve, not really describing how they want to enable other companies, except for a few. And that is something that I would love to talk about with other people in the panel later on, because I think the current guiding principles, they're more aimed at regulating things with a few big companies that we can think of, the publishers prominently. We want to regulate some old mechanisms rather than create a new open market. And in that sense, I think these guiding principles, they start from the right angle, but they take the wrong turn. To highlight some things of what I think goes wrong is, besides this focusing on regulating what we do right now rather than providing rights, is, for example, the guiding principle 1 about owner of data and metadata, which I think in the Elsevier deal already goes wrong. So clearly the principles cannot have been written up clearly enough, because if I look at the text mining part of the Elsevier deal, for example, the text mining actually is extracting metadata from these articles, but the ownership is claimed by Elsevier. They control the metadata that is in the publications that we share with them. Now, of course, open science is way more than just publications, which is another aspect of these guiding principles that it touches not really well on. It focuses on some things which are really centered around these classical publications. There is some mention of data, hardly mention of software. I didn't see anything about standards, so we have a lot to talk about. A last thing that I want to highlight here, because the interoperability one, GP4, is the one that I will want to say about more, is not really about interoperability as we talk about it in open science. It really is about talking to each other, and this is a huge risk. And I'll stop with that. We should not be talking, we should be doing, and these guiding principles do not provide for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Egon. Those are some very strong views that many others will probably like to reflect on later on. But first, I would like to give the floor to Vanessa Proudman. Vanessa, would you please unmute yourself and introduce yourself and give some first statements? Yes, you're unmuted now.
I'm frozen.
We can hear you, Vanessa. While Vanessa is fiddling with her system, I would like to move on to our next speaker, and we hope we can get Vanessa back in a moment. So I would like to give the floor to Emma Ganley. Emma, could you please unmute yourself and introduce yourself and give some first statements on these guidelines?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the invite to be on the panel today. My name's Emma Ganley, and I have quite a long history of over 15 years working in publishing, primarily in an editorial capacity, and most recently as chief editor at PLOS Biology, which is where people may have heard my name from more than protocols.io. So I've always been very involved in policy and advocacy around open access publishing, but have also had a deep engagement while wearing different hats along the way with data availability and open data. So as a lead for the data policy task force at PLOS for several years, I was also a core member of the team who implemented the PLOS open data policy back in 2014, which I think really helped to change some expectations broadly about availability of a lot of research data that was previously being kind of held captive numerous different places. In addition to PLOS, I worked at Rockefeller University Press over the years and was also a project manager for an open source software tool, which is the open microscopy environment. So again, that was around making microscopy data available. And so thinking about metadata and research data has been a recurring theme through my career. Current position is Director of Strategic Initiatives at protocols.io. So this, I think, is a potential market tool that may be an interesting tool for exploration as part of this open knowledge base, which is, I assume, why we would be invited to participate today. So it's an open access platform for method development, sharing, and publication, and primarily used by academic researchers, although it's not solely restricted to them. So we were asked to reflect on one of the guidelines, but I've got some brief overall impressions, and then I'll focus in on 3 points, and actually it will bleed between 3 of the different guidelines that you have, the guiding principles. So overall, they seem incredibly well intentioned, and looking ahead at how best to ensure ongoing access to and appropriate ownership of the research metadata being produced, especially I think in view of GDPR in Europe, and also especially in view of the agreement that was reached with Elsevier. This seems critical to have some core understanding that can be shared commonly by everybody. And the need for this interoperable infrastructure and appropriate governance all makes complete sense. But so I'll delve a bit more deeply into 3 specific elements that I find myself pondering more about as I read through the guidelines. And so the first is governance, which is alluded to in several places in the guiding principles 4 and 6. And I'm sure there'll be widespread agreement around the need for community-owned governance around interoperability and with respect to any resulting open infrastructure. But while it's alluded to and will be key in making things happen sensibly, it doesn't really yet seem to be a defined governance structure or model in place. And this is really a critical element, I think, that's needed. A lot more specific information will hopefully be forthcoming about who would oversee and mediate or moderate any decisions that are actually being made about the tools that should be included for any pilot projects or taken forward. It's not really clear right now how things would work. It seems that everyone would own the resulting open knowledge base infrastructure, but it's not really clear who would have control over this infrastructure, or how decisions would be made and what might ultimately be chosen for inclusion. The second element that I was pondering is in the 5th general principle, which is about the open collaboration with the market. And I think it's great to see an appreciation that outsourcing services to different market players will be a critical element to preventing de facto monopolies from transpiring. But it's a little bit unclear how external other market players might be able to get a foot onto the collaborative ladder right now. Presumably, the deal that's been struck with Elsevier has consumed a large % of the annual budgets for the next few years. And it's not very clear what might be left that would be available for investment into other vendor services and people who provide different technologies who may have interest in rolling out pilot tests with various institutions there. There may be some open academic projects that could easily engage, but for a lot of enterprises, there are business models that will need to be supported for them to realistically be able to contribute. And so I think there's maybe a need for some more openness about actually what would be available to go into this open knowledge base for all players involved. I think there's a little bit lacking in transparency right now. The third element is interoperability. So perhaps echoing a little bit of some things that have already been said, which is clearly a desirable thing, but in reality, if it's a strong requirement, this may be a big ask for some new vendors to achieve whatever the requirements and stipulations are going to be for this level of interoperability. And some of the large publishers, including Elsevier, who've been working on creating interoperable hubs of different tools for some years now, probably have a competitive advantage at this time coming into the table from day one, which may still skew the market. And so that might impact this in terms of open science rollout or open research. Yeah, as I said, I represent protocols.io. So this is a potential infrastructure tool that could be used and be very useful across Dutch institutions. And it would be really helpful to have more clarity, I think, about the processes that would need to be followed for any external market vendors who were interested in pitching to be included in this open knowledge base, which, again, given an already existing agreement with Elsevier, it's a little bit unclear what the opportunities are for other people financially and just in terms of collaborative effort to bring things forward. Is having a detailed API sufficient, or would this need more active involvement on the part of other partners who would like to be involved? And just to finish with a question on discussing this with colleagues, there was a question that kept coming up too about how the Dutch open knowledge base would integrate more globally, so outside of the Netherlands. It will be amazing if Dutch research institutes can forge ahead and create this open knowledge base for use within the Netherlands and across the Netherlands, but it's not really clear how that will connect with collaborators who are outside of the Netherlands, or just more broadly with changes that are happening at different institutions in different other locations. And there are a lot of other locations who are choosing to decline big deal subscription contracts with publishers right now. So there seems to be a bit of a disconnect. So I think it's a really good place for a lot more discussion. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Emma. Those are some very interesting views and important questions, I think. We're glad to see Vanessa back after having some problems with her camera. Vanessa, I would like to give the floor to you to introduce yourself and give some first reflections on these guidelines.
So thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm sorry about the terrible timing of crashing just before my presentation, but I'll be back and hopefully you'll stay with me. So I think what I'd like to do is first start off, talk about some of the positive things about those principles, and also some of the things that I think could be strengthened, some things that are missing that are important for the research community and for open science in general. So firstly, I think it's very positive that there's coordinated strategic action. Looking at some of the principles of engagement, if you're going to liaise or forge new partnerships with commercial entities. Kristen was already talking about the values. It's also acknowledging how important principles are for the community right now, because it's really needed right now, because trust is absolutely paramount. We have seen, for a number of reasons, and there are questions about who should we be collaborating with, to what extent. There are increasing dependencies on certain large commercial partners. There are concerns about lack of resources, and also concerns that publishers are diversifying to a large extent, also right across the research process. And is that in the actual interests of our research community and all of those who've been working in open science? So we need principles of engagement, to also clarify what we expect. And I think that could be perhaps strengthened in these principles. But aside from that, we've also seen in the last years a number of important principles that both funders of open infrastructure are looking at when deciding on what to fund in the future. So looking at the Cameron Nealon-Lynn principles of 2016. You've also got the core SPARC principles for scholarly communications. So there are a number of principles that are really key rules of engagement on what we think is important for our community when partnering or funding certain services or infrastructure. So I think what's also good about these principles is that there are they are for the first time, one of the first times actually looking at research data. So there are a number of principles for scholarly communications, publications. Neelan's principles does look at a broad spectrum, but this particularly looks at research data. So that's a good start, I think. We need to look at defining stricter principles for research data and data analytics. So now I'd like to just come to some of the perhaps areas where areas of further improvement, perhaps. So I live in the Netherlands, and what I miss is the Dutch directness, I think, in these principles. So the clarity, the expectations from our community when we are engaging with other commercial third parties. What is important for our research community? We are intervening, we are collaborating on their behalves. It should be in the interests of our institutions. What do we need? How can those third parties serve us well? And I think that tone could be set stronger. I think somebody talked about the definitions. I think there are some definitions which could also be tightened and really clarified so that there is no doubt about what some of those requirements are, and they could be more requirements than they are currently stated. I think what would also be really useful, depending on whether these are just going to be used in the Dutch context or further expanded, is in the preamble to talk about what are the risks and the opportunities of working with third parties. So being clear about that, yes. And it's not actually so much about access or ownership, it's about the reuse of data. And what are the terms and conditions?
Can I interrupt you for a moment? Could you round off so that we can move on to the last panelist? Yeah.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. And so I think something else that's really important that is missing is we need more transparency. So I think there should be more demands about that there should be no NDAs, there should be open procurement. We should, if algorithms are going to be used based on the data that we give away as a research community, we should know what is behind those algorithms. And we should really specify the conditions for the reuse of that data. Yeah. What are the consequences? Also, if you're looking at analyzing the productivity and the performance of our institutions, should we not be specifying what can be done with that data and what not? Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Very much, Vanessa, for that nice plea for more clarification and definition of what's in the guidelines. I would like to move on to our last panelist, Jean-Sébastien Caux. Could you please unmute, Jean-Sébastien, and introduce
I'm unmuted. Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot to the organizers of this session. It's already quite interesting, and I hope we'll pack a lot into the last half hour. My name is Jean-Sébastien Caux. If that's too complicated for you, just call me JS. I'm a Canadian citizen, but I've been working in Amsterdam for many, many years. I'm a professor of theoretical condensed matter physics at the University of Amsterdam, and that's my day job. That's what I do with most of my life. I'm a researcher. I solve problems. That's what I'm paid for. And of course, as an author of academic papers, I confronted many problems with the publishing workflow that we have. And over the years, I was extremely frustrated with many experiences in there, and I used to ventilate a lot about this. And at some point, my colleagues got kind of fed up of me talking about publishing like that, and they said, "Look, JS, either you do something about it or you shut up." So choose one of the two. And then that was part of the motivation to indeed implement kind of hobby project now called SciPost, which is an alternate infrastructure for scientific publishing, covering the whole workflow from preprints all the way to metadata curation, preservation, archiving, discoverability, etc. So we're active in the fields of physics mostly, but we're currently expanding to other fields. If you don't know it, just go to the website and have a look at it. So essentially, the discussion of tonight is really focused on a particular document that is very much in the news now. And I kind of read this document as if I was refereeing it, so as if it was an academic paper. So of course, there are many good intentions in there, as already been said, but there are quite a few missing pieces. Actually, so for example, section 3 is missing. And I wanted to propose a section 3 as it might have been booted out by the people in there. And for me, really the section that was missing is about the academic users of open knowledge, which really I think determines what the requirements should be for any infrastructure, determines the priorities that should be given to the development projects that are going to come out of that. So when I start thinking about that, I really think about my own job as a researcher. As a researcher, of course, I author papers, I read papers. So for me, accessibility is super important. One of the big things that we have in physics, of course, is the archive preprint server, and that has one massive advantage, which is that it is a centralized portal where worldwide you can immediately discover what you need. There's no balkanization of the infrastructure there. Everybody goes on the same site and finds what they look for. So the convenience of having one port of call is something which is really, really crucial to the way we do things. Of course, you also want to have the capability of doing super smart search queries, filtering, swimming the corpus in there. So all these things are important as you're thinking about authoring and doing the researcher. But that's not the only thing we do. We have to manage our data as researchers. We have to store it, curate it, add metadata to it. We need assistance to these things. So there's really a lot of development to be expected for these things. As researchers, we're also group leaders, communicators. So we need to have access to the information that we need, all the list of funding opportunities, the list of conferences that we have. These days, there's so much activity online with conferences. It's nice to have lists where you can see what happens. And finally, you can hear your favorite researchers giving talks because everybody's moved online. Young people need to find jobs, so job listings with particular conditions in there. That's really important. If you're a researcher working also as an editor, you need to be able to find your referees, the most appropriate referees for certain papers. You need to be able to have tools to manage, conflicts of interest and things like that. Finally, as an administrator, also, you need to provide reports. Wouldn't it be convenient to have one button where you could click and have all one person's particular publications for one particular year in a well-agreed format, or kind of internationalization of the publication CVs of researchers. So what's the common theme about all of this? This really has to do with metadata about research and how you handle it, how you standardize it, how you make it accessible to everybody. And I think if I try to connect with the document, that really brings me to start mildly with the theme of interoperability, which for me is through the archive example, absolutely crucial. But I think the underlining theme in my thing is also convenience. If you want efficiency of the whole infrastructure, how quickly you can get to what you need. And as far as I'm concerned, that goes to the governance bit at the end, ironically, because I think my biggest worry about the current developments is that despite the fact that this is written in these documents, there is inevitably going to be an extreme vendor lock-in in any system that will be developed outside of the control of the academic community. And as far as I'm concerned, the last guiding principle should not be community-owned governance. Governance is not enough. Governance is just like giving indications or things. What you need is actually community-owned implementation. You can have external parties, of course, produce some tools for you that you will have, but the actual implementation of it, the infrastructure of it, has to remain in a kind of academic controlled organization. Think of a kind of UNESCO of metadata like this that we could build with all these things. So for me, Internationalization is also crucial. I think it's very good that there might be a start in a certain country, but right from the beginning, it's important to program internationalization in so that it has a chance of really being a useful tool for researchers. And I would really be extremely disappointed by the current negotiations if we ended up giving away the infrastructure that we need. After all, we scientists are able to run particle accelerators of incredible complexity. We are talking about publications, metadata, and things like that. Surely this is within reach.
Thank you very much, Jean-Sébastien, or JS. Those are some nice reflections. Again, I think in all with our 5 panelists, we already got an amazing amount of views and questions. I would like to move on with giving the floor to all of you to reflect on each other's views. And before we do that, I would like to remind everyone listening that you can put in questions for the panelists in the chat. We'll have a look at that and put them before the panelists. So could I ask you all if you have any reactions to what one of the other panelists has said to voice those? Yes, Kristen.
So I just, hearing the thread across all of my fellow panelists that these guiding principles are just a starting point, but lacking in some of the more implementation-oriented, practice-oriented, the depth, that Jean-Sébastien just discussed about. It's not enough to govern; you actually need to really build and own. I mean, you take it much further into the implementation areas, and I just think that seems to be a theme across all of us, and maybe we should delve a little bit more into what actions and next steps the community could be taking.
Thanks. Maybe if I can just add a little thing to that, I think one of the things which is really not talked about in this document at all is a vision for the actual implementation. Who will pay? Who will actually control it? Who will develop it? Who will essentially maintain it? All these things are not in there. And this is going to cost a lot of money. And this is money that will better be pooled by academic organizations worldwide into some super organization instead of having like localized efforts going here and there, balkanizing it. I think this will end up being much more costly if we fail to do that. So for me, that's what's missing. There's a proper attack at the, if you want, the business model behind it. It's just not there.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. That's my observation as well. We set some ideas. What I said earlier about regulating what we're doing right now, but the investment should really be in something that everyone can reuse, and that is not what we're seeing here. There is no information about the being able to use it. Several panelists mentioned this. What about smaller partners? How do they get involved? How do they get on the ladder? As someone mentioned this, I totally missed this as well. We see this reflected, for example, is in that none of the ongoing open infrastructure projects being reflected in some way or another. I think about things like open citations. Citations are mentioned briefly, but not what they are for. It doesn't really specify investing in a future that everyone can build on, but it focuses on collaboration with some larger partners that we have been working with, and that is not the way forward.
If I may as well, just to step back a little bit, when I started thinking about this, it wasn't entirely clear to me how supported the Elsevier tool set is, given that the deal has already been struck with Elsevier. So I also think there's some clarification needed to kind of place in context exactly what that deal means for this open knowledge base and its development with other tools in the marketplace, because I really feel like there's a lack of clarity there as well.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
What I was going to say is that one of the things which I keep noticing in the publishing industry is that people still think that it's a market, but it is not a market, certainly for publishing. Once you have made a choice of where you publish, the choice is made. It cannot be undone. I cannot take my best cited papers and renegotiate with my publishers the worth of my product and put it somewhere else. My decision to put a paper somewhere is not based on financial things. If you wanted to run a proper market for publishing, then please, pay me my hourly wage for reviewing, for all these things. So the notion that necessarily there has to be a market for these things is sometimes faulty from the very beginning. I view the big infrastructure for metadata and data in science more as I view a kind of global museum. You don't have market competition between museums. Museums hold riches, they preserve riches, they make riches available for people who are interested in those. And that is the role of the kind of structures that we're talking about. So I would really I would like to have much more critical thinking about the precise layer at which the market can be useful. But I think it's too high.
Yeah, I think the market idea is not bad, but it should be based on top of the central knowledge base, not be the knowledge base itself. We have our data, our metadata, our scientific stuff, and companies, small and large, can build services on top of that, which makes the access easier or faster or more pleasant to look at. But the foundation should be reusable by all of them. And I agree, that cannot be a market. You cannot compete for something that will only introduce scarcity, which is exactly what we're seeing in the current publishing world.
Kristen, you wanted to reflect as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think, at the root of this, the commercialization of content initially is a root problem, right? And we can talk about, once we've commercialized the content, which happened in the 20th century, then you have people building more and more commercializations on metadata and other kinds of information around that. And at a certain point, scholars lost scholarship. They lost control of this. And the only way to regain control is to sort of claw back from there. And it's challenging because a lot of innovation has come from the commercial sector. And it's possible that had this all been in the hands of, the institutions and funders, that some of that innovation would not have happened. So we need to carefully consider what it means. But when you get back to the question of values and principles, the values and principles will always essentially be misaligned between what governments, funders, institutions, and their stakeholder communities think scholarship should be, and what the public expects from it, from how you monetize it. So, I think we need to move from the values and principles stage into the implementation of that. But the only way to get there is to get agreement on the values and principles. I think Vanessa and others mentioned, a lot of the work that's already been done, like the Nail and Lynn Builder paper, the work that's been done by SPARC, and recently there's been work done by a project I'm working on, the Next Generation Library Project, headed up by Educopia. Catherine Skinner has worked on an excellent values and principles document. They're out there, but we have not invested in creating a shared understanding on that, an agreement on that would then drive everything else. So getting to implementation without that shared agreement is not going to be time well spent. And I think as soon as we start to get that shared understanding and agreement, we'll realize that this disconnect between the way the commercial providers are operating and what our expectations are is insurmountable.
So I think in practice, some of these principles are being used. So if we look at SCOSS or IOI, we're also thinking about looking at some of those principles that feed in, I think I already mentioned this, to selection criteria for what one would fund and trust in the future. So if you look at the French Open Science Fund, for example, they have invested millions of euros this year into open infrastructure, both locally on a national level, but also internationally. And they've also helped fund some of the SCOSS recommended services, but under the condition that those services speak to some of the Nayland principles and how far they do. There are also some essential criteria that must be complied with before they get considerable funding, so that, for example, that there's good international governance. That's one of them. So I think actually some funders are now looking at some of these principles that are being developed from the SPARC principles or the Nayland ones that SCOSS has developed and others, to help make some of those decisions. But I agree, we could perhaps firm up some of these, certainly for research data. That's really necessary, and discuss and affirm some of this more globally.
It also ties into to one of the questions in the chat from Cameron Nayland, who asked about, okay, if we think about the qualities of sets of principles, what would a good set of principles in this context do? Or what would a good set of principles look like? And I also think that both Kristen and Vanessa also touched on the fact that, is it principles that we need, or do we now take the next, do we need to take the next steps and to see, based on these principles, what do we do and how do we do that and what's needed for that? I don't know if anyone wants to reflect on that, beyond that.
So maybe I really do think we need some strong principles for research data, because there are really some concerns about how some of that research data might be exploited by the commercial sector, and that could steer our research institutions, so that could influence, for example, choices about directions, research directions, which may be influenced by publishers or what they tell us about the data that they've analysed. So we wouldn't want that to be in the wrong hands to influence us, you know, when it's not following our values. So that's why I really think we do need some good, strong principles for research data. But of course, we need to follow those up with practice. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a nice aspect. Very briefly, I think indeed the guidelines focus a lot on metadata and on business intelligence of the universities and the other higher education institutes, and that is one thing that really struck me. If I think about open science and an open knowledge base, it is about knowledge about the things around us. Of course, this includes my direct work environment, but I rather have this about research, more about open research, less about universities and higher education institutes.
So, if I may, actually, I mean, to me, the principles are absolutely fundamental. The principles are the very motivator for everything we do about science. That's why, you know, we do this stuff anyway, because we believe in it. In a sense, I think, to me, everybody agrees on what we want on the academic sector. We do want openness. We do want accessibility. We do want ownership. We do want, you know, fair evaluation of all these things. I think what is missing is the solution, the machines that enable us to do that. And I think this is the kind of lever that the commercial sector is so good at playing, because it takes a lot of efforts to build an infrastructure that will serve these needs. And the commercial sector is in a position to do that. It's difficult for a society publisher to do that. It's difficult for a guy like me to build a thing like SciPost. It takes a monumental effort. However, let's imagine a world where this is trivial. You can do it in 5 minutes. Then there is no negotiation. There's no need to argue about principles or anything like that. Everybody's in favor of curing cancer. Everybody's in favor of, you know, getting rid of poverty. The question is, how do you do it? Which tools do you have? And I think the institutions at the top of these negotiations on the academic sector are too hesitant to find other ways of solving this infrastructure problem. They immediately go to the commercial sector, whereas there are perfectly capable alternatives to do this. So I think the key to the solution is just to build the right tools in these different ways. And then, because of usability, because of convenience, because of, you know, just having it work better, then it will take over. Not pushed by the principles, but pushed by the convenience, really.
Kristen, want to respond, and then afterwards I'd like to give the word to Emma also.
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree. We were in violent agreement that we need principles. We're in agreement that there needs to be an implementation of that, and that's hard. I think what comes in between, and I talked about the shared understanding that needs to happen, then the next step is adoption. So principles have to lead to policies. These policies have to come from governments, funders, and institutions. I don't think it's the institutions alone. I think funding policies have driven enormous amounts of change. And if we engage that trifecta of governments, funders, and institutions in adopting policies based on these principles, that then drives the ability to create infrastructure that meets the needs of those policies. So that's an intermediary step I think is absolutely critical.
Yeah, so if I may as well, I mean, I agree that the principles you have here, the bare bones of the principles already in place are really good, right? I think we all agree with the premise of the open, interoperable, accessibility of all of the metadata. But I think, so someone in the chat talked about opportunity, future opportunity. And I think that's also what's missing for me. And I kind of alluded to it earlier. It's really about the transparency of the opportunity to provide solutions and bring disparate members together and actually create solutions to the issues that we're facing here right now. And I think we just don't see what's actually possible without knowing more about the actual opportunity that we have to do something really, really sensible and smart to try and solve this problem for the Netherlands, but also hopefully more globally than that.
Egon, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think I agree with the intentions of the document, but not with the principles. So we just talked, already discussed it doesn't really focus on an open infrastructure. And this interoperability is a nice example of that, I think. If we look at GP4, if we look at interoperability as part of communication-owned governance, so that's the mention about interoperability. But if your guiding principle is, yeah, let's talk about it, I think we really start off in the wrong way. Let's talk about it, to me, is not a principle. The principle is, for me, okay, we commit ourselves from the start to be interoperable, and we do not postpone that to a later discussion. So GP4 is one of the principles that I do not have a lot of trust in. That will not get us to a real open infrastructure. We've been talking for more than 20 years already.
Anyways, yeah, Vanessa?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Egon. So I really think that the tone of the principles, they need to be a lot stronger, and requirements about what we expect and what we feel is important for these new collaborations and for an open infrastructure to work well. Yeah, I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, I agree with that, actually. Now, I am Dutch, so I like direct talk, but I think this is really essential. What we saw in the call for open science, the Amsterdam call for open science a couple of years ago, that led to a lot of extra energy in open access. But I tried to get a clear definition in there of what open access actually was, the principal rights of what is open science, being able to redistribute it, modify it, and sorts, the things that really allow us to collaborate, that invest us without having the chance that we lose our investment later on because someone decides that, oh, you no longer have access. Now, I see basically indeed the same mistake being made here. In these principles, we do not have a clear enough description of what we understand with an open knowledge base, that everyone will run off with it, just as we see with the current Elsevier deal, where we have statements in the deal that says that anything from a pilot project, all the IP from that goes to Elsevier. I honestly do not understand how that can be compatible with what these principles have in mind, unless we have the explanation that these principles are simply not clear enough. I totally agree.
Yeah,
now we're all waiting. Yeah, we're all waiting. No, I was also answering Kristen in the chat. It's really nice to see in the chat this really rich discussion also taking place there, which is what's happening in a lot of these things. We'll try to save the chat and perhaps share it with make that available as well. We'll discuss that. We're getting close to the hour, but one thing that specifically one of the last remarks made that clear for me. In these principles and also in the implementation of that, I think we agree on the openness of the research outputs and the reusability of those. To what extent do these panelists feel that also the infrastructure itself should be, for instance, open source? Should that be a requirement, or anyone wants to respond to that?
Absolutely no question about that. I mean, how can anybody in their right mind even hesitate about this? I don't get it. Look, I'm also happy. People often think that I'm like anti-commercial and things like that. I was trained as a stockbroker. I'm from North America. Come on, I know how markets work. It's great. But if you want to, we can build a market-driven publishing thing. But then we use market principles at all levels, not just at the publishing level. At the whole production side, the whole research side, the whole job side, me writing, refereeing, etc. All commercial, fine. But this is not the way this works. This is a communal good. And I think the infrastructure is part of the edifice of publishing. And to have infrastructure that deals with the corpus of science that is not open source is, in this day and age, a total failure of policy.
I totally agree with that. If we do not have an open core that allows commercial enterprises on top of this, just by huge investments, probably more expensive than sending a rocket to the moon, then you do not create an open market. This is what I see breeding in this document. So I very much and totally agree with JS.
Emma?
So yeah, well, so protocols.io is not open source. I am a huge open source supporter and believer, but our tool is not open source and it is a company. All of the content is open access and it can all be mined via the API. And so everything there that's public is completely available. It's complicated though for businesses that need to create these systems to actually do so in a way that's sustainable. So it's not a trivial thing to just assume that we would be able to have a company that provides an infrastructure tool that could be open source because it was able to receive enough funding from the Netherlands or from whoever else wanted to fund it. I think in an ideal utopian world, everything would be open source, but actually it can be much more complicated than that. So I think that it probably requires more discussion and thought as to how that is actually considered as being whether it's a requirement or not. And maybe being able to access and mine all content is sufficient, even if in an ideal world you might be able to also have the infrastructure open source. Perhaps that's not possible or feasible.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would say in 5 seconds here is that this utopian dream is one hair's width away, because it only requires commitment from the higher funding instances, international funding organizations, to enable these things to be funded. So you wouldn't have to worry about your business sustainability, your coders, and maybe you would even win much more kudos from the community if it was open.
Vanessa, I'll give you the last word, and then we'll go on to the final round.
So just very quickly, linking up with what Emma just said, it is complicated. How open can open science infrastructure be, and how open is it? What are the ambitions of openness? So we are currently doing a survey into open science infrastructure in Europe, and actually asking some questions about are you open source? Are you using open APIs? How open are you? To understand where people are on that journey, because funders want to know, our research communities want to know, and we also want to see how can we help them become more open? What are the difficulties and challenges with that? So I look forward to reporting back to you on that in the next months, because we want to understand about the infrastructures that have their homes in Europe. How open are they, and what are the challenges in becoming open? Thanks.
Thank you. We're almost at the hour. I want to close off with asking you each for one last question, and basically asking you each for if you could give one recommendation to institutions on what's important in collaborating with third parties. What would that be that would guarantee that open science is not compromised?
Okay, I'll start. Three things. First, invest in the shared principles. Do it right, do the work, make it agreed upon universally. That's hard to do. Translate that into policy, governments, and actual requirements. And then the third is actually invest in the infrastructure. It's expensive, as people have said, and it needs that investment.
Thank you. Egon?
Open licenses. Open licenses have been invented basically to enable collaboration. Ignoring more than 20 years of open licenses at this moment would be just silly. The higher education institutes must require open licenses.
Thank you. Vanessa? Can you unmute?
I'm going to have to say, of course, invest in infrastructure and think about how you can do that as a community, both end users, researchers, libraries, societies, funders, governments, that we all think about new ways of looking after the things that we've been investing in to ensure that essential infrastructure delivers in the interests of the values of our research communities.
Thank you. Emma?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to do. One place I might consider starting is actually trying to educate all of the researchers and academics as well about the importance and the value of what it is that they do, and the importance of the value of considering how they disseminate the knowledge that they uncover and reveal, how they publish it, all of the underlying data. I think there are some kind of poor practices that have happened because of this pressure in academia to do the research, and some of this value of disseminating correctly has been kind of lost by the wayside, which is really unfortunate. And I think it's made the mission of open science that much harder, or open research in general. And then the other thing, I would really take time. I would suggest that institutions take time to consider their options very carefully, and not necessarily just take the easy existing tools that are out there, and look around much more widely at what's available and what's a much more logical long-term investment rather than a short-term quick fix.
Thanks very much. And Jean-Sébastien?
In the name of academia, by all means, invest in open infrastructure. Recognize developing initiatives with open ideas in there that try to break through this. Stop going back to the default of the last decades, the demonstrated, essentially, outplayings that you've suffered as negotiators on the high sides of the academic side at the hands of the commercial entities of the last decades should be reason enough for you to be more weary in your negotiations. Shift your focus to different things. Try to reform the academic recognition that young people obtain when they try to experiment with new things. Just be more imaginative. I don't see much imagination in this document.
Thank you. I think we are nearing the end of this session. Thanks everyone for sharing all your thoughts. I think the most difficult part is ahead of us, and that is making sure that all the vice chancellors will watch the recording of this. But thanks again, everyone, for being with us. Thank you all for watching this and putting in your questions in the chat. I advise everyone to briefly go through the chat. There's a lot of additional ideas there. I would like to give the final word to Bianca.
Yes, there's actually not much else for me than to repeat big thanks to all our panelists for your time and all your insights. I really enjoyed this discussion, also discussion with all the participants in the chat. And as Jeroen said, I think this is really only the beginning, and we've got a long way ahead of us, but I also think it's a good way, and we'll get somewhere in the end that we hopefully can all be happy with. Thanks a lot. Enjoy your evening, your day, your morning, and enjoy the rest of the Open Publishing Fest.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.